Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you today at this amazing event, the Carbon Trust Net Zero Energy Transition Week. Let me start by saying that this is absolutely the right topic to discuss because we are now, happily, in the UK, locked into a remarkable period of change for our energy system. And that's because just a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister made the very bold and very welcome decision to agree to the recommendations that my organisation made for the path ahead for UK emissions. So that's what we're going to talk about today to kick you off. The targets that we have recommended for 2030, for 2035 and ultimately for 2050 really have locked us into now a very steep path and a very ambitious path to full carbon neutrality. So it's a pretty important and a remarkable moment for this country, which is important because as we are preparing now to host world leaders for COP26 at the end of the year in Glasgow, where I'm speaking to you today, that kind of ambition is what we need to see from the UK and from other developed economies around the world. So today I'm going to try and give you some of the headlines of the change that lies ahead for the UK energy system, just to give you a sense, I suppose, of how all-encompassing and indeed how exciting this change is going to be for us in this country over the coming years. So if we could just bring up some slides and then we can get going with this presentation. So thanks very much. We are the Climate Change Committee, you can see here. We are tasked under the Climate Change Act with spelling out the path for emissions reduction here in the UK, also ensuring that the UK tackles the climate change emergency with the urgency that it deserves. The task that we've had over the last 3 years has really been dominated by the wholly new assessment of the path to net zero emissions that we've made in this organisation. And you've seen, I'm sure, lots of that in the reports that we've published over the last 3 years. In our 2019 report, which recommended the net zero target, and then latterly in December with our report on the UK's 6th carbon budget. Now, happily, our recommendations for that total path have now been accepted by the Prime Minister and indeed the Prime Minister before him. So let's just have a look at what that path implies and how it looks. So this is the chart to remember as you continue throughout this week. It shows the UK's historical record of cutting emissions by almost a half since 1990. Some uncertainty during the pandemic about where we ended up, but still a really strong record of progress in cutting emissions since 1990. And then the important thing is the purple line. That's the path that lies ahead for UK emissions, guided now by those legal targets for emissions every 5 years. That's the carbon budgets you can see in the coloured blocks. Now, the implication of the path ahead, which is now being put into law, is that we need to achieve at least a 68% reduction by 2030. That's known as the UK's NDC, our nationally determined contribution to the Paris process, and 78% by 2035. So a 78% reduction in emissions from 1990 to 2035. That target, in effect, has brought forward the old 2050 target. We used to have a 2050 target to cut emissions by 80%. It's brought that forward by 15 years. That's the implication of the net zero target in the UK. That path for the next 30 years is front-loaded. So over the next 30 years, the first 15 years are where we do 60% of the emissions reduction, and the next 15 years are when we do 40%. That's because that front-loaded path drives investment post-pandemic. It drives new option creation in cutting emissions, also in new industries that we'll create over the next 30 years. And of course, we're minimizing the cumulative emissions that actually cause climate change. That's very important for the Paris process. The shape of this chart really matters. Hopefully you can see it's an inverted S shape. Now that really tells an important story. We have done very well to decarbonize our power system in this country so far by closing coal, of course, but those opportunities have largely now been taken. So what lies ahead involves us scaling up action over all the other sectors of the economy. So you see that relatively shallow fall over the 2020s before the major emission reductions happen over the 2030s. And then we cruise into 2050 with the last remaining sectors to abate over the 2040s. That's the shape, that's the S shape that you're going to see more of. Let's just see what drives that overall. And this is one of my favorite charts, a rainbow chart. The top of this chart shows you what would happen in an imaginary world if the UK could turn off its climate policies from tomorrow. You see that emissions would rise over time. The bottom line is the path that the UK needs to follow. And you can quite neatly categorize the steps to get from that black line to the purple line in 4 ways. These are the 4 things that we need to do to achieve net zero on that path that is now being turned into law in the UK. The purpley stripes, number 1, are about demand reduction, energy efficiency. This is particularly about things like home insulation, being more resource efficient across the economy. If you look near term, out to 2025 and 2030, you'll see that that's a big share of the total emission reductions that we are proposing and recommending. The second of the steps is the take up of low carbon solutions. This is by far the most important thing. The red, the orange, and the yellow stripes here are us adopting low carbon technologies across the economy. This is the electric cars that we'll be using. This is the heat pumps that we'll be using in homes and businesses, also the hydrogen technologies. The third stripe there, the blue one, is expanding our low carbon energy supplies. This is us moving to the low carbon fuels that will run those technologies, especially about decarbonizing electricity, also about clean hydrogen production. And then the last stripe, just to mention it, is the net in net zero, the green stripe here, reminding us that it's not just an energy story. There are some sources of emissions that we can't remove, all the cows and the sheep and the planes mainly, that we will have by 2050. We can't quite get rid of them all, so we need something to offset those emissions. And that's the green bit here. This is us actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere with trees and energy crops and woodland creation. Really important to see the kind of effort share across the economy that you can see in that rainbow chart overall. What underpins that is a pretty new outlook from us on the fundamental challenge that we face and how we change the assets that we use across the economy. And that's the next thing I wanted to just show you here. So this is the most boring slide you'll see from me today, but this is a table that just gives you a sense of how that asset transition that we need to see takes place. Major part of the transition ahead is guided by a set of very necessary phase-out dates for high carbon assets and activities. So if you bought a fossil fuel technology today, its average useful life would be 15 to 20 years. That means we need to stop selling those assets from around 2030 if we want to make the 2050 goal. So just have that in your mind. You can see the importance of that here. Just a few highlights from those phase-out dates, just to give you a sense of how imminent actually some of these changes really are. 2033 is when we recommend that we have to stop selling and installing gas boilers in homes and businesses in this country. 2032, we have to end the sale of petrol and diesel cars and vans. That's just about in line with the Prime Minister's 2030 commitment. He's allowing hybrids to 2035. That really needs to be a niche thing if we're going to be on the right transition. And 2035, really important point for the discussion on energy in this country. That's the point when we recommend that we need to stop burning natural gas unabated in the power system. So that's the date, to all intents and purposes, when the UK will have zero carbon electricity production. That's the implication of the path that has now been agreed by the government. Worth just pausing to consider the importance of the decade ahead then in scaling up to that 2030 point. That's really the decade of policy making that will get us to the right point by around 2030, when we're ready to start really turning over the capital stock of the whole economy. So in this just last part of this presentation, I want to give you a sense of how dramatic that change is for the energy system in the UK. Just a few illustrations of that. Let's look first at electricity supply. So in our assessment, we will double, at least, possibly even triple the size of the total power system. Our recommended path gets to 80% of that supply coming from renewables. That's mostly from offshore wind. We have about 100 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. Plenty of space in the seabed for that kind of capacity, so we could even do more. Nuclear is the orange section here. It's largely the same in 2050 as it is today, although that could easily be something else beyond nuclear with similar properties, something like CCS, for example. You can see hydrogen being used as a fuel for electricity progressively over the 2030s as a replacement for natural gas. So that's the kind of supply story here, really dramatic increase in clean electricity supply. And this is the flip of that. This is the demand story on electricity, a stunning change really in electricity demand as we electrify transport, we electrify manufacturing, we electrify heat. The technologies using that electricity tend to be more efficient than the oil and gas fuel technologies we use today. So the energy system overall is smaller in size by 2050, even as our electricity system doubles or even triples. That overall system cost of that transition will be minimized if we can use that power in a smart, flexible way. So that's really a necessary component of a smooth transition to net zero. We're going to need new, very innovative market arrangements to drive all of that, particularly at the consumer end. So that idea of energy flexibility and power flexibility and giving the right incentives to the consumers is really at the heart of this transition overall. Alongside all of that, we see as a complement, hydrogen growing as a big part of the energy system. Very sizable hydrogen sector develops for those applications that can't be electrified, from almost nothing today to something that's actually 2/3 of the size of our current electricity system by 2050. So that gives you a sense of how rapidly that changes overall. We're mostly using hydrogen in manufacturing as a replacement for natural gas, also potentially in shipping, probably as ammonia. We expect the main source initially to be blue hydrogen, as they call it, so taking natural gas, capturing the carbon to produce hydrogen. But we see over time an increasing role for green electrolysis, green hydrogen from renewable electricity. We're going to need trials of hydrogen to make that possible, so that happens over the 2020s. And that gets us to the point where we can be confident that we can use hydrogen in those ways. Alongside all of that, we see some equally stunning changes in our high carbon energy use. And I won't go into too much detail here, but oil use falls by 85% by 2050, first from light vehicles, then from larger vehicles. And by 2050, we're only really using oil for jet fuel in planes. And natural gas, our use of natural gas falls 75%. So a bit more than we've said in previous assessments. We're using more renewable electricity, more electrolyzed hydrogen than we have in previous assessments to produce that hydrogen. It means less reliance on gas with carbon capture and storage than in previous assessments we've made. By 2050, natural gas is really only being used with carbon capture and storage, so for power generation and for hydrogen production. And lastly, onto the story that we're going to need to talk a lot more about, which is carbon capture. So you can see here how carbon capture grows over time. The purple section is hydrogen production. So that's natural gas being used with carbon capture to produce hydrogen. That's blue hydrogen. And in the electricity sector, you can see in yellow there. If I just click on, you can see really interesting, the green section here is us combining our carbon capture facilities that we will need probably 5 to 10 of up and down the country in major industrial plants, with the bioresources that we have plentiful supplies of in this country to get negative emissions. So you can see that that's providing something of the order of 50 megatons of negative emissions, and a really important part of the story of getting to net zero overall. We think that element of it could even be paid for by those sectors that continue to use fossil fuels, especially something like aviation. So really interesting set of changes. And the very final thing I wanted to end on is a chart I've been talking a lot about over the last few months. Finally, we can, with this analysis, say something about the overall investment proposition, which is in itself an amazing story. So to get to net zero, we need to raise overall the total investment in the UK economy from about 10 billion a year that we spend at the moment on decarbonising. That's the investment challenge at the moment, to about 50 billion pounds of investment, 50 billion pounds of extra capex by 2030, driven by the 5 things that you see there mainly. So surface transport investment, that's the electric vehicles and the charging, of course, for those vehicles, the networks for those vehicles. The investment in our buildings to decarbonise them, investment in the electricity supply, investment in the energy networks that underpin all of that, and the major investment that we need to make to decarbonise manufacturing and construction and fuel supply. So the energy the industries overall that we have. So decarbonising industry. Those are the big investment priorities. 50 billion a year, which is adding about 1/8 to total investment across the UK, is a major investment plan overall. We'll need policy to drive that. But the very happy story, just to end on this, is that we can also say something pretty impressive, I think, and remarkable about the benefits of that investment beyond just the carbon savings. We are now seeing that green energy is the cheapest energy, especially if we look at the renewable electricity that's being produced around the world now. Latest auction data shows you that it is the cheapest form of electricity generation. It is now out-competing fossil-fueled electricity generation. So that's a really good story, and it means that there is a return to the consumer over time for this investment and this transition. We do not need fossil fuels for cheap energy any longer, and that's a brilliant thing to be able to say to you. So over time, we see that very significant investment cost is actually cancelled out entirely by the operating saving of those new assets that we've invested in over time. So it's a hugely positive story of progress. You can see, particularly in surface transport, the benefits of using those electric vehicles actually outweigh by far the cost of investing in those things in the first place. That's a positive story I expect to continue. It means that the overall story of net zero and the transition is going to be worth it, not just for the environment, but also for the economy itself over time. And that's the story really that I want to leave you with. We have, of course, so much to do, but it is so important that we do it, and so important that we achieve this transition and show the world that the UK is an economy that can do it with all the benefits that will come with it. So I'll leave that with you, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of this week, and lots and lots to talk about, I hope, in the future. Thanks very much.